Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone can hear us and see us well. First of all, welcome to this side event, which will cover the critical issue of IEDs, focusing particularly on their impact and solutions in Yemen and in the Sahel region. Just to start off by way of brief introduction, first of all, I will be moderating. I'm Josephine Dresner. I'm the International Policy and Partnerships Director for MAG. We're a humanitarian NGO with a particular focus on humanitarian mine action and management of weapons and ammunition. And our panelists, and first of all, our key donor and host of, in fact, the whole National Directors of Mine Action meeting is the German Foreign Office, who here are represented by Heike Thiele, who is the Director for Civilian Crisis Prevention and Stabilization. And I understand has a particularly personal interest in this issue, having been based in Niger in the course of a long and illustrious career. So we're very lucky to have her here with us. Our second speaker will be Alfredo Malloret, who is coming from UNIDIR, their Counter-IED expert. And he has particularly been focused at UNIDIR on co-authoring the Counter-IED Self-Assessment tool, as well as other key guidance to assist states and other actors in managing weapons-related issues, and therefore a key expert on this issue. Again, very fortunate to have him here. We will lastly have a presentation to be delivered jointly by colleagues from UNDP, focusing on the work done by UNDP in Yemen. First of all, Gareth Collett, who joined the British Army back in 1986, and after leaving the army, fortunately joined UNDP as Chief Technical Advisor in Yemen, assisting local security forces and government agencies with capacity building. And he will be sharing his presentation with Mr. Steve, who also is working for UNDP with nearly 30 years experience conducting field operations in many regions across the world. And he also is working as a Chief Technical Advisor for the UNDP Mine Action Programme in Yemen. So thank you very much to all of our panelists for joining us, and we're looking forward to an interesting discussion. And with that, I will give the floor to Ms. Thiele. You are on mute, I'm afraid.
Must have happened. Thank you, Josephine. Good afternoon to everybody. Ladies and gentlemen, dear co-panelists, I'm really delighted to join this side event to give our input on the question on how we can approach the threat improvised explosive devices present from a humanitarian and from a stabilization perspective. I can assure you that for Germany, the question on how to tackle the IEDs in mine action has become increasingly important and remains on the agenda. While legacy landmines are rather cleared than laid, improvised mines pose an increasing danger in countries like Afghanistan, Colombia, Iraq, Nigeria, Syria, and Yemen, to just mention some. The nature of today's conflicts, with mostly non-state actors involved, IEDs become even more dominant than traditional landmines. This is the reason why we target the challenge with two different approaches, the humanitarian and the stabilization mine action, not to forget the prevention aspect. Our commitment for humanitarian mine action dates back to 1992. This was even before the Ottawa Convention entered into force. But now we still focus on traditional landmines and cluster munition remnants, and also especially take into account IEDs where it is needed. Especially since 2013, the number of accidents related to IEDs increases each year. Non-state armed actors who are either insurgents or simply criminals use these weapons to threaten not only states and UN missions, but also, and in a very persistent manner, the civilian population, and keep it suffering even when a conflict could be reduced or ended. However, IEDs are different than traditional landmines, wherefore the mine action community needs to find new approaches to ensure the safety of affected persons. As some IEDs have similar characteristics as traditional landmines, we include clearance of IEDs within our humanitarian mine action projects whenever possible. This task is not always easy. Our partners must make sure to respect the humanitarian principles: humanity, impartiality, neutrality, and independence, in order not to get involved in the conflict directly or indirectly, and hence be considered a target. While traditional landmines are usually produced industrially, IEDs are, as their name already states, produced in an informal, improvised way. Other than with traditional landmines, we cannot refer to different models or even construction plans. This makes them even more unpredictable, more dangerous, as one of our partner organizations experience, unfortunately, on a very regular basis. They suffered a terrible loss when 2 deminers passed due to an accident with improvised explosive ordnance this February in Afghanistan. To come to the prevention aspect, IEDs, informal and so-called improvised manner, as well as their evolving character, makes it also much more difficult to regulate and to limit the access to the components that are necessary to build IEDs. This is also why there is not a single solution in the sense of one fits all to prevent the proliferation of IEDs. But instead, we need a multitude of efforts and initiatives. Alongside the humanitarian challenge of clearing IEDs, the international community will have to tackle this even more challenging problem of components, trade, and export. Luckily, we have on our podium today a representative from UNIDIR that has also been working on this facet of the IED problem. Today, we see that in many contexts, countering IEDs requires new approaches. We commend the government of Afghanistan for having introduced the term abundant improvised mines, which defines that improvised mines can be cleared for humanitarian purposes once they are no longer used by any party to the conflict anymore. Our second approach is stabilization mine action. The threat to peace and stability posed by IEDs is also present in many contexts where we are engaged in stabilization and crisis prevention. Here, the need to include mine action and counter-IED efforts in stabilization thinking becomes apparent. Contamination by mines and the insecurity that follows is an inherently destabilizing problem for any community. In areas that are contaminated by IEDs or mines, a normal life as we know it is not possible. Therefore, a goal of our efforts is to enable the post-conflict return of civilians to their homes, but we also want to increase their trust in security forces and the state as a whole. This is counteracted by the presence of IEDs. Houses may be booby-trapped. Infrastructure that is critical for day-to-day life may be inaccessible. Governmental services such as healthcare or school education cannot be delivered. One key way we work on this issue is through strengthening demining capabilities of our partners. We work together with governmental partners.
Has anyone else lost Heike?
You lost me?
Still Heike.
Okay, then I continue. One way we work on this issue is through strengthening demining capabilities of our partners. We work together with governmental partners as first responders in affected countries to strengthen their capabilities to effectively react to IEDs and mines. And we are following this approach together with UNMAS successfully in Iraq and northeastern Nigeria, where decontamination with IEDs and displacement of civilians, which is interconnected, is a major threat to stability and post-conflict peace building. These activities are in line with our principles on security sector reform, effectiveness, legitimacy, respect for the rule of law, and allow our partners to take on more responsibility and agency in decontamination of affected areas, create sustainable capabilities, and underline the legitimacy of the state as a provider of safety. As a provider of safety, we think about civilian security forces, be it the police or specially trained civil defense corps. The second objective of this approach is a clear recovery perspective in formerly concerned areas by IED. Naturally, our counter-IED activities in stabilization cannot follow humanitarian principles as our counter-IED efforts in the humanitarian realm do. We want to follow political goals and need to be partial by supporting governmental forces over others. That means we do have two different perspectives, but tackle the same problem. As mentioned by our Minister of State, Niels Annen, yesterday, during the opening remarks, states as well as non-state armed actors must stop their use of landmines, cluster munitions, and improvised explosive devices. We call, therefore, particularly on armed groups to not threaten civilians and ensure the safety and security of all human beings. We encourage all parties to end development, production, delivery, and use of landmines and cluster munitions, as well as to destroy existing stockpiles. Our objective is to increase human security, deliver humanitarian assistance where access is impeded, and support victims to enhance economic development, to plan for further economic activities, and to build trust. We must all work together to challenge the status quo and find new ways, new approaches to include a comprehensive response to improvised explosive devices. We need best practice, like the Improvised Explosive Device Clearance Good Practice Guide from GICHD, which contribute to preserve knowledge and advance the response. We need common standards to help prevent accidents of deminers as well as civilians. And we need to increase our knowledge about the proliferation of parts which can be assembled to be used as an explosive device. With these words, I give the floor to my colleague Alfredo from UNIDIR, who is of the C-IED maturity model, one great tool to show how to develop a coherent national response in affected states. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Just please confirm that you can hear me. Okay, and now just please bear with me 1 second while I share my slides. Can you confirm that you can see my slides? Okay, I'll take that as a yes. Well, good morning, colleagues, fellow panelists. It is a pleasure to be speaking today. Thank you for the invitation to present the UNIDIR Counter-IED Self-Assessment tool. My name is Alfredo Malaret. I'm a researcher at UNIDIR, and I want to take this opportunity to present a tool we developed designed precisely to counter IEDs. I will remain at the theoretical model level, and then my colleague from UNDP will present the tool in action. It is not only a good way to show how we turn research into action, but also a good example of the UN delivering as one. First, I want to start by briefly introducing UNIDIR. We are an autonomous institute within the UN. We're a think tank focusing on disarmament and security. Our goal is to assist the international community develop practical and innovative ideas needed to find solutions to critical security problems, such as the evolving threat posed by IEDs. Now, what is the UNIDIR Counter-IED Self-Assessment tool? UNIDIR was requested by the General Assembly to develop, and I paraphrase, a voluntary tool to assist states on IEDs. Pursuant to this request, with the support from the government of France, we developed an accessible, easy-to-use tool designed for states to self-identify challenges in preparedness to counter the threat posed by IEDs. In developing this tool, we have consulted a global network of stakeholders, including hosting 2 review meetings, distributing the draft to over 70 experts, and carrying out 2 pilot tests, one in Yemen and one in Spain, to ensure the tool is fit for purpose. So what are the ultimate objectives of this tool? Based on the gaps and challenges identified after conducting a self-assessment, the objective is to leverage knowledge to enhance prevention and response strategies. It could also help define the priority of work and monitor progress, since you can repeat the assessment and compare against previous results. Now, how is the tool organized? In a nutshell, components of Counter-IED are divided into 2 broad categories: upstream activities, those aimed at preventing IED events, and downstream activities, which are associated to a response to an IED event, should one happen. So left of the boom and right of the boom. The basic premise of the tool is that the more mature the prevention measures, the less response measures will be required. To discipline the range of counter-IED activities, we have maintained the concept of upstream and downstream components. This slide shows the activities outlined in the tool. You will see that not all the activities are focused directly on the IED event, and this is because other measures, such as risk education, border controls, control on precursors, among others, are also important, and that is why we have placed significant emphasis on a whole-of-government approach to countering IEDs. In the tool, the effort to assess these activities is structured around a capability maturity model, or CMM for short. Now, what is a CMM? And I think we can define the CMM as a set of structured levels that describe how well the current practices can reliably produce required outcomes. The main benefits of using a CMM include that it provides a baseline or benchmark for the basis of comparison and indicates critical gaps and areas where improvements might be required. This graph presents the 5 maturity levels utilizing the self-assessment tool. And just to illustrate the range, for example, level 1 initial indicates that the approach to countering IEDs is not well defined, and it is conducted by units responding with minimal training and equipment and not in accordance with the nationally defined policy. Whereas level 5, optimizing, the other end of the range, signals that the state has fully functioning cohesive structures which can deal with a complete range of IED threats, and international cooperation is mature. Now, how to use the tool? The most important step is to assess each counter-IED activity identified in the model. The tool provides questions and guidance on assessing each activity against the 5 different levels of maturity. For example, just take risk education. Are awareness messages updated as a threat posed by IED evolves? And after that question, it is followed by criteria to situate current practices in its corresponding level of maturity. Then, after assessing each activity, reach consolidated results for upstream and downstream components. Results then can be used to establish a baseline of capabilities across the prevention and response cycle, then prioritize efforts to improve capacity and maximize international cooperation. In this last aspect, I would like to highlight the importance that the tool can have in aiding regional efforts to develop coherent regional strategies against IEDs. To be clear, information generated by the tool can be useful for states to improve national practices, but also for states to utilize in dialogue with regional partners. And please note that the tool is voluntary and involves no reporting requirements. How does a self-assessment look in practice? Well, a simple data visualization app has also been developed based on Microsoft Excel. The application uses a series of Excel tabs to enter data, which one tab per Counter-IED activity. The application also provides a mechanism to add free text, to include open-ended comments of interest that may be acquired during assessments. And two separate summary sheets, one for upstream and one for downstream components, will automatically display the consolidated results like this. The consolidated results use a radar type chart to provide a graphical representation of upstream and downstream maturity. An example of the results is shown on this slide. A table will also provide an automatic of the individual maturity levels for each Counter-IED activity and an overall average for upstream and downstream components. The output from the self-assessment is an indication of the current maturity level. I want to conclude this intervention with 4 key takeaway messages. First, this tool is a product of a collaborative design and a testament to the value of working together. Second, the data visualization app facilitates the collection of data and display of results. Third, it is a voluntary tool and is now available in English, French, and Spanish online at unidir.org/CIED, and it's also coming soon in Arabic. And fourth, I encourage everyone to use the tool to improve preparedness and reach out to us if you need any guidance in deploying. To move from research to action, I leave you with Gareth Collett, my dear colleague from UNDP Yemen. Gareth is the current Chief Technical Advisor on countering IEDs in Yemen, assisting UNDP, the Office of the Special Envoy, and the local security forces with capacity building. Thank you very much. And on to you, Gareth.
Thank you very much, Alfredo. I will now move into share screen mode as well. And hopefully you can all see something in front of you. Well, I'd like to thank Alfredo for introducing the Counter-IED model first of all, which Steve and I are going to talk around. Yemen's one of very few states to experience an IED threat on land and at sea. And since 2018, believe it or not, there have been just under 2,600 IED incidents recorded on IMSMA, with the national authority, that's our dear friends the AMAC, responding to approximately 71% of them, given attrition within the local security forces. IEDs range from simple pressure plates to complex remote control devices, and I'll leave it to Stephen to go into more detail on the maritime dimension. Now, the threat posed by non-state armed groups, criminals and terrorists is geographically based, as these pie charts show you, with Hadramaut, Hodeidah, Shabwa and Taiz experiencing the lion's share. And as at the end of 2020, because we like to work in complete years, Hadramaut, Shabwa and Taiz overtook Hodeidah as epicenters of IED-related activity, contributing to 57% of all devices reported. Criminality and terrorism have been the main drivers, with UXO and IEDs outpacing conventional mines as the prominent injurious mechanisms in urban areas. With the support of the internationally recognised government, UNDP Yemen has been running a combined mine action and rule of law programme to counter the threat posed by IEDs since March 2019. But rather than examine counter-IED through the more traditional pillars, we have chosen a novel human rights-based approach, establishing empowered community networks at governorate level, with representation from community leaders, governance institutions, and the emergency services. For it is understanding concerns at community level where lasting peace is won and confidence in the rule of law restored. In this very simple model, the doctrine behind which we published later this year, community feedback informs affordable resource mobilisation and improves service delivery to defeat IED issues. Now, we did consult widely across governorates where we had access and received input from implementing partners to determine the predominant human rights issues. These consultations incorporated feedback from hundreds of previous EORE sessions, just under 500,000. So far, our consultations have involved some 4,000 community leaders and other senior members across 25 employment categories, with consultation identifying problems associated with mines and land release in rural areas, and IEDs and UXO in the urban domain. And using the UNIDIR Counter-IED model, thank you very much, Alfredo, we piloted this in Yemen, and with the government's support, we did identify a number of upstream and downstream issues that, if resolved, would improve human security. But I point out from this that you can't do them all with limited resource and funding, and it does require focus. So specific issues identified for immediate action by communities, with a requirement for IED disposal training, a downstream initiative, as you can see, that's within the national authority, the UNMAS, and IED risk education, an upstream measure. And that's across communities relevant to the precise geographical threat within their area. On the latter, we work closely with UNICEF, HI, GICHD and UNMAS, receiving permission to use a number of EORE products to improve the safety of children and teenagers who are the predominant victims. Given the attrition rates within bomb disposal teams in Hadramaut and Shabwa, two governorates we focused on, one person killed or injured per 13 IED incidents attended, and a civilian casualty rate of 3.15 civilians killed or injured per IED explosion, it was simply not possible to develop an EOD capacity in line with IMAS competencies. As such, UNDP conducted a training needs analysis to design an IED disposal good practice course around these shortfalls. The first pilot course ran in Hadramaut and Shabwa in January 2020, with a further 2 courses being run in Hadramaut and Taiz in the October of last year. Now, this culminated in 40 people being trained to a degree in IED disposal. That's around about 10 teams, and it included the first 3 female bomb disposal officers in Yemen's history. Now, the training of females was also sanctioned in terms of mine risk education and non-technical survey, which the accompanying videos to this side event demonstrate. To date, I'm pleased to report that there have been no casualties amongst bomb disposal teams in well over 330 IED disposals, and in excess of 1,040 civilian lives and livelihoods have been protected. These include women, children, and prominent figures vital to Yemen's future ceasefire. In those governorates receiving training, bomb disposal team availability has increased upwards to 90%, meaning that a whole host of explosive-related incidents ranging from IEDs and UXO can be dealt with. The training initiative has proved to be a significant force multiplier, with the government requesting that training expand into Taiz and Aden this year. We've also worked with GICHD to inform the IED Good Practice Guide, which Heike mentioned, and that was formally published in December 2020. All of the above has strengthened that one downstream and upstream measure that I mentioned, with funds provided by the US, the Netherlands, and the Regional Bureau of Arab States. In terms of the IED supply chain, we've worked closely with UNMAS Somalia and UNODC to better understand the maritime dimension surrounding Yemen. And with GICHD in support, this has culminated with improved information management and introductory discussions with the Coast Guard on IED component precursor and recognition. Through working with UNODC, this has led to a specific threat in Somalia being linked to Yemen, and render safe procedures have been shared. UNODC is also working on a Yemen maritime counter-IED booklet, which not only includes IED components, but also the most common explosive chemical precursors that can be exploited in Yemen. This has had a knock-on effect on border controls, the control of IED precursors, and improved cooperation and information sharing. We've also delivered forensic materials to the Criminal Investigation Department, to attempt to reduce the burden of over 2,000 outstanding CT-related cases. And I'm sure you agree that in terms of downstream, it improves scene exploitation, evidence analysis, and technical exploitation. And whilst we're at the start of the process, UNDP has liaised with the judiciary to examine issues with continuity of evidence. And courses for 30 senior judges and members of the Supreme Court were conducted in February of this year to improve specifically the judicial process around IED-related activity. We've also worked closely with ICRC to ensure that the rehabilitation of the forensic facility in Al Jamhouri Hospital links to the needs of the C-IED to assist in the respectful identification of the dead. Again, this strengthens recovered evidence analysis. Funds for next year are earmarked for maritime survey and the security and control of explosives, and further task integration with DRG, HALO, NPA, UNMAS and TDI. We already work with GICHD to improve national legislation at the subnational level and local implementing partners and NGOs to establish nationally owned programs for community cooperation and information sharing. And is all of the above working? Well, from my perspective, the answer is yes, if you look at this slide. This shows what we've done in Hadramaut, Shabwa and Taiz in 2020 compared to the two previous years, 2018 and 2019. Very simply, the blue bars identify lives and livelihoods protected from IEDs, and the amber bars indicate lives and livelihoods impacted by IEDs. As you can see, in 2020, the blue bar is outpacing the amber bar, which is where we really want to be. Taiz, not so marked because we only focused on Taiz in the last quarter of 2020, but we're looking forward to see how results comply at the end of this year. And if you look at the infographic for Hadramaut and Shabwa, you can see how IED team availability has increased over time, and also how the casualty rate amongst teams dealing with IEDs has reduced. So in summary, a community-led subnational approach to counter-IED based on human rights promotes horizontal programme integration and delivers capacity. As Alfredo mentioned earlier, this is where we see ourselves at the end of 2022 compared to where we were at the beginning of 2020. And donor funding is being put to optimum use, and you can see how we're eating out from the centre of the radar diagrams in areas where we can deliver effect. And the beneficiaries are the people who live within those communities and the governorate forces that protect them. The conditions for restoring confidence in governance and rule of law institutions becomes a reality. So I'm now going to hand you over to Stephen, put myself on mute and start the presentation again. I'm too old to be able to work out how to do it consecutively.
Thanks, Gareth. I was just waiting until the yeah. So maritime countermeasures. This is a quite a new project in Yemen, but it's based on a growing and perennial threat. We have the next slide, please, Gareth. The current and protracted conflict in Yemen, one of many in the last decades, is primarily between the Saudi-led coalition in support of the internationally recognized government, and it continues today. In addition, there is a growing presence of armed groups with either their own ideological or criminal intent, with a multitude of allegiances between the various groups. The asymmetric conflict, now in its 7th year, affects every aspect of life for the population. Use of information or misinformation is weaponized and systemic. Deep-rooted corruption financially feeds the conflict. Currency manipulation, human rights violations, and food and water insecurity are just some of the examples of a broad range of hybrid and asymmetric warfare being conducted. Seemingly, Yemen continues in its inexorable downward spiral towards humanitarian and economic catastrophe. That hybrid warfare has now spilled over into a wide range of explosive ordnance threats in Yemen's littoral waters and near coast waters. This includes land-based threats from anti-tank weapons and artillery in nearshore areas, and attacks on shipping to improvised, and also includes improvised static buoyant mines. The next slide, please, Gareth. And here's two examples of two buoyant mines which have lost their tethers and been washed ashore. These are contact mines for the ships. And then the next slide, please. And we also have the waterborne IEDs in various formats: remote controlled explosive laden skiffs or speedboats, as pictured here, to improvised underwater torpedoes. Both include suicide versions or remote operated. And lastly, is the limpet type magnetic mines. There are also a number of pinch points in the Red Sea, which are particularly vulnerable to these attacks, such as the Bab al-Mandab Strait between the Horn of Africa and Yemen, and in the approaches to the ports along the west coast. Next slide, please. So what perhaps started as a defensive measures by Ansar Allah forces against a potential seaborne invasion has become offensive in nature, with attacks on commercial shipping and naval forces. Passing trade ships and a once flourishing fishing industry are all affected, particularly in the Red Sea. This is yet another hurdle for humanitarian access, as nearly all the food, fuel, and other essential supplies to keep the country one step away from widespread starvation arrives via the seaports, largely on the west coast. The Maritime Countermeasure Project has many concurrent activities and components similar to operations on land, includes both upstream and downstream mitigating measures. Upstream is to adopt the measures to prevent proliferation of the contamination in the first place, and the downstream component includes activities to counter the threat once it's already in place. When looking at the Counter-IED maturity model for Yemen, as already described, all the categories will need to be addressed to fully control the explosive ordnance contamination off the coast. There are precursors such as upstream U2, security and control of explosives, as has already been highlighted, as a preventative measure. Explosive harvesting and the lack of controls on explosives allows the situation only to perpetuate. Within the Yemeni Mine Action Programme, this is the land-based aspect of it, one target activity has been the removal of AXO, or abandoned explosive ordnance. Next slide, please. And so you see there on the left-hand side of the screen, abandoned explosives, and that is harvested potentially for all forms of IEDs, and in this context, the maritime IEDs. In addition to that, there is also the need for legal reform, strengthening the judicial processes if U2 is to be successful. And I would also include other precursors such as electrical components as seen here. They need to be interdicted ideally before entry into country under the U5 category of border controls. Individual components are often harmless and quite innocent until constructed with other components to form the active IED, many of which can be purchased quite innocently on the open market. Upstream 3, the Counter-IED risk education at sea. This is a new area for me, something I've never come across before. That is targeting groups who are using the dhows, the trading craft, and other trading craft, fishing vessels, humanitarian aid ships passing onto the west coast and the southern coast as well, and passing trade ships en route to the rest of the world through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. It's also true the downstream component of the project will run concurrently, including the more obvious elements such as D1 and D4, which are the IED response and the information management. However, at some stage, the full spectrum of activities will have to be included if the goal of removing the maritime threat and future threats is to be realized. The next slide, please. Yemen's coastal areas considered non-permissive or semi-non-permissive environment within which to operate from a mine action perspective. It is a matter of creating the space to operate and will best be conducted by partner organizations already operating in country. In the immediate term, the aim is to map the explosive contamination and other explosive threats to shipping, identifying areas of safe passage and potentially underwater clearance of those areas deemed absolutely necessary. The longer term aims would be to include the removal of all the identified contamination, but that'll have to wait until the conflict has stabilized and there is a robust peace process, or at the very least, binding ceasefire is in place. In conclusion, from the outset, the plan has to be realistic and realizable. Operating in a semi and non-permissive environment while the conflict continues, systematic clearance is not a viable option. As such, the immediate aim is to contain the situation by taking measures to prevent weapon proliferation at sea and to identify clear lanes for safe commercial and humanitarian operations. In this initial phase, clearance will only be conducted where there is no practicable or workable alternative, all while maintaining humanitarian and commercial access to the ports essential to feed the nation. Next slide, please. And just to conclude, adopting the land-based concept of land release, the focus will be non-technical survey and technical survey, then followed by clearance where required. And that is just the interim phase during the conflict that we're currently experiencing. And with that, I think I shall hand over back to Joe when we're all open to questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stephen, and thank you to all of the panelists for your presentations, which were fascinating and very useful contributions to what is obviously a very live discussion in our sector. I think before we begin the questions, I would just like to apologise, particularly to Tila, for my slight confusion towards the end of your presentation, where I lost my connection and then interrupted your talking and typed over it. So my apologies for that. I couldn't see or hear what I was doing. Moving on, I see already that we have some great comments and questions in the chat. And I believe if we just work on a first come, first serve basis, we have a question from Matt Wilson at FSD, which I think has a few aspects to it. And that's a question that's directed, I think, mainly for Gareth. I don't know if you've had a chance to read through Matt's question already, Gareth.
I've always worried about Matt using 1,000 words for 3 or 4, but I have read it, Matt. And yeah, the neutrality aspect is always one we have to consider, which is why we sought approval before we did anything with the internationally recognised government and also the governors of the governorates in which we were able to operate. And then as you fall down from that, you get in touch with the local security forces and the community leads. And with a human rights-based approach, you're only reacting to areas that fall into the space to which Heike alluded to earlier. I mean, I call it cold IEDs, those that are legacy, those that have caused an issue post-conflict. On occasion, there is going to be the situation where a team may respond to something that is in the hot space, which is still part of the active conflict. But in terms of the community network that's been established, that is decided by the operations team, and then that's passed to any capacity that the local security forces has to deal with it. In Yemen's case, that is going to be a military response, given the denuded capacity within civil defence. But it works as good as we can get it for a state that's in conflict and has both those hot and cold spaces. And the render safe procedures are obviously as good as the devices that we come across, and how much exploitation is done of those. And that's at the very early stages in Yemen. So the The training that we provide on IEDs at the moment, just to try and keep people alive, is based on the semi-remote process to provide separation from the bomb. So if there's any issue over a render safe procedure, it can just be simply blown in place. So we do the preservation of life, the preservation of property, and returning the situation to normal as soon as we can. Forensics takes a back seat, as it always will do in humanitarian operations. So we are focusing at the moment, to answer the last question, I hope, Matt, on the local security force element, which is the UNMAS. That's the national capacity. That's those who fall within the UNDP programme, who receive funding from donors to do simple mine action activity. If we ever get any funding to look at the police and civil defence, we will start to eat into that. That will ultimately take pressure off the UNMAS and allow them to do other things. But at the moment, as I mentioned, with UNMAS responding to 71% of every single explosive-related event in the country, it's going to be them for some time yet. They're going to be Spartacus for a while longer. I know you won't be able to respond. Put something quickly in the chat and I can respond later if that's the case, but I hope that answers some of your question. Over.
Thank you very much, Gareth, for that a comprehensive answer to an indeed comprehensive question. And I see also, before we move on to the next question, a helpful comment from Haider at UNMAS Iraq, which connects both the legacy issue with the kind of the newer IED contamination issue. And this is something that also I was very pleased to hear come out of Heike's presentation, and generally I think it's a very commendable part of the GFFO approach to both mine action and combating diversion of different types of weapon. You know, really, although we have in the past perhaps as a sector thought of new contamination and IEDs and the discussions around what counts as a landmine and what doesn't, we've thought of these as two distinct issues, but really we start to see in many places that to think of these things separately is actually not very helpful, because the legacy mines are not only still a humanitarian danger, but they're also a potential source of explosives, a potential source of components for new devices. And I think to continue to look at all of the entire issue in the round is very, very helpful. So I just wanted to make that input myself, and then thanks again, Haider, for your comment. Next in the chat, we have a question from Tammy Hall, and that's specifically on Alfredo's presentation. Alfredo, again, I hope you've had a chance to read the question there. And if so, I will hand over to you.
Yes, many thanks. Can you hear me first? Well, thank you for that question. It allows me for the opportunity to expand on it. And the Counter-IED UNIDIR, that self-assessment tool, it is designed as an assessment to find gaps and challenges as opposed to find the right solution. So it leads you to ask the right questions, in a way, if you will, as opposed to leading you towards a solution. And that's a beauty, in my view, of a self-assessment. We're not prescribing anyone, and we are providing a model for Gareth, for example, to conduct a baseline examination and find where he can be most useful, and then prioritize and take the effort in that direction. The other point that I want to make is that where it sits, the Counter-IED tool. And yes, there is a tendency the security sector tends to take the lead in this aspect, but it's not limited to the security sector. It is, in fact, designed with a whole of government strategy that spans across the governance system for them to be involved in the process of countering IEDs, especially in the prevention part of the self-assessment. And with that, I think, since we designed the tool and Gareth has been so active in using it, it might be good to hear Gareth's experience in using it and how has it been helpful in prioritizing efforts. So Gareth, over to you.
Thank you, Alfredo, and thanks, Tammy. From our perspective, by sticking to upstream and downstream capacity development and working with the government institutions. So, for example, in Yemen, the lead government institution is the Ministry of Interior. because every government has to have a lead for something. So Counter-IED is looked after by the Ministry of Interior, but the good thing about the Ministry of Interior in Yemen with an ongoing conflict, it looks at all the agencies and organisations available. And one thing we found out early on, it was questions about who was mandated to do X, Y, and Z. Who could respond, who couldn't respond. And that's why when I used the example earlier, when you get into contested territory, you're not going to see a humanitarian organisation respond to anything in that contested territory. It's either put out of bounds and left for the military to deal with, or it is, you know, people do as much as they can in terms of marking and identification to try and keep people away from an area that's as a confirmed hazard. That's about as much as we can do. So I've found personally that looking at the forces and elements that are available in a country, you can pretty much soon identify who can respond. And by doing that, you're making best use of available capacity, which again fits into the UNIDIR model very, very nicely. That's an aspiration that was started in Iraq around about 2016, 2017. It was called the blended solution. The paper was written on it by the EU in terms of how things could be pulled together. Names change, but put simply, if you get everybody in a room, in particular those people who are responsible, and talk to them, you can identify a solution that actually suits humanitarian and military and allows those boundaries to be understood. There will always be crossover. You will have that blurred area. But from our perspective in Yemen, if the blurred area is there, we don't cross it. But we are providing utility to the civilian population just by doing cooperation and information sharing, which again is part of the beauty of the upstream piece. So from my perspective, Yemen is a good example of it's good to talk. Over.
Thanks very much, and I think it's an interesting, well, and very consistent aspect of any of the IED challenge that we are always dealing with, both challenges around state capacity, but also challenges around highly unstable contexts with access challenges and lack of predictability. And often the experts that have come from a mine action sector background are in particular can be more used to dealing with a post-conflict environment. And when you're actually dealing with something that is this complex, and trying to collect data in particular, you are often trying to do the best you can rather than do what is perhaps perfect in such a situation. And I think the development of the kind of tool that UNIDIR has talked about is really, really important in that kind of context. I see additional comment from Judy Grayson, just in relates to the human rights-based approach. I see that it is a comment rather than a question, but I think it is important. And I just I wondered whether any of the panelists wanted to volunteer any thoughts on the human rights aspect of this in particular.
I feel like I've talked for ages, so I'm quite happy for somebody else to say something. But yeah, thank you, Judy, for that question. Human rights is a fundamental issue for getting stuff done, for things to work in the long run, which is why we have looked at this as a combined mine action and rule of law activity from a sort of UN DP perspective. By doing that, you're building on the strength of IED threat mitigation and the levers that UNDP has within the rule of law programs for IED prevention. Again, that fits into the sort of model that UNIDIR have pulled together. And the consultation bit is the bit that's really important, because I find a lot of organisations go into areas and do a lot of good work, and quite often it's not really focused on what the population wants, because ultimately, for a solution in Yemen, you've got to restore confidence in the rule of law. You've got to restore confidence of the community in the police force, in any other organisation that has a mandated responsibility for their human security. So by working with the community on human rights-based issues in conjunction with the security forces, it allows both of those entities to work more harmoniously together, because after all, it's the local security forces actually live in the same community that they are trying to protect, and it makes everybody's life much easier. A very, very quick example would be finding out that by the police running a very, very simple football game, you find out from the police running a football game that's completely neutral, that the children can't get to the football game because they've got to go across 2 minefields, 3 roads that don't work with no lighting. And in that, you can do priorities for lots of other things. The football match goes ahead, everybody enjoys it, the community's enthused, the police have done their bit, the community feel listened to, and that's a really important bit as well. So I think combining mine action activity with rule of law activity with a human rights-based approach does eat away gradually at problems and delivers solutions that are pretty much neutral. They're not taking the side of anybody, and as a result of that, can't be exploited in Yemen's case by party 1 or party 2. Over.
Thanks very much, Gareth, and I think we're all happy to be hearing so much from you. Certainly no complaints here. Perhaps a question, if I could, for Alfredo, particularly thinking about the Sahel and the impact of the IED problem in the Sahel region, which, whilst anecdotally we know is significant because of the challenges in collecting data, it's actually quite hard to know what the real nature, extent, and location of all of that contamination is. And it seems that there is a need for a regional approach, perhaps in the Sahel. So I wondered how the IED tool, Counter-IED tool that has been developed by UNIDIR could perhaps contribute to regional strategies, or perhaps has already. Over.
Thanks, Josephine. I appreciate the opportunity to expand the regional strategy that I mentioned briefly. So by what we mean is that it can help develop regional strategies, that since it is a standardized set of assessment, it creates a baseline that is comparable and the same metrics across different countries in the same region. And with that, you can use the same baseline to then find common challenges, common gaps, similar threats, and discover dynamics that cross borders, for example, the trafficking of components or precursors. Using those assessments, if a sub-region completes standardized assessments, then we can create that and build it up, bring it up from the lower level to a bigger level, and create a sub-regional strategy based on common challenges and share and maximizing opportunities. And in terms of more concrete plans, and yes, you're right, we are working in that region of interest, and we are planning to work. It is our future for 2021, 2022, and we are partnering with ECOWAS and other interested organizations to develop a sub-regional strategy. The first step in developing a sub-regional strategy is have everyone conduct the same self-assessment so we can have comparable baselines. Josephine, since I'm already unmuted, I'll take the question by Emanuela Elisa Cepolina, and it's about assigning weights, a statistical term, to the different components. And we did consider that, and we stayed away from that, since we don't want to be prescriptive in the sense that we value from the get-go what's more important to you and what it isn't. And that's what essentially assigning weights to a methodology would do. What we create is that we create the 16 components, and you can evaluate them and see which is more pertinent to your context in questions. Since it's a tool with global applicability, we stayed away from assigning weights. But yes, it is very tempting to think we know what's probably most important, but we leave that up to the context in question when conducting the self-assessment. And over.
Apologies. we are, of course, running quite short on time. Alfredo, thank you very much for really helpful answers to both of those questions. And I know that we will need to finish shortly to go back to the plenary. A couple of people have raised in the chat the issue of removing perhaps the use of counter from the name of the Counter-IED tool, and I just wondered, perhaps Alfredo, Gareth, what you would think about that. And after that, I think we probably will need to wrap up. And I see that Matt will probably have some more questions for people outside of the session. But perhaps Alfredo, first of all, your thoughts on changing the title of the tool.
I'll just say thanks for the suggestion. I appreciate GACHD contributing in such a positive manner. We have run this through several feedback sessions and groups and expert review meetings, and this has been passed. And we will produce an updated version of the tool since it has been rolled out and used and tested. We will produce a second version later in 2022, and we might adapt the name to better reflect the feedback that we get from the field after it has been tested and used for a whole year. Thank you.
To finish off, the Ministry of the Interior in Yemen never asked us what it was called. They were just interested in upstream and downstream capacity development, IED prevention and IED threat mitigation. We don't talk about counter-IED capability maturity model when we discuss activities with the member state. Basically, what we do is we use the model to record activities in a way which those who are using it understand. So I'm quite relaxed about what you call it, as long as people are able to use it and get benefit from it. But that's a very, very good question. Over.
Very much to you all, and I think actually my final question about also discussions with UNMAS, which I know are ongoing, it's an important one, because I think obviously the IED issue is so large and so multifaceted that we must all remain aware that there are many different actors and indeed many different sectors that are working on this issue, and that good coordination and good communication will continue to be essential. And that's why, it's fantastic to see such high attendance at this session, and such a wide variety of participants' comments in the chat. So I would just like to thank all of the panelists for their excellent presentations and from their replies to the questions. And thank you very much, everyone, for your attendance. I hope you enjoy the rest of the meeting.
Thank you all.
Yep, thanks all.
Thank you all.